You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Chris Emanuel, outgoing president and CEO of the Central York Chamber of Commerce, to talk about the future of young business owners in Canada. With traditional career paths shifting, we explore what young entrepreneurs need to thrive and how chambers of commerce, policymakers, and other community members can help build a local economy that supports young people.
Thanks for joining me, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, small businesses, but with a specifically youth-focused lens, because I think that's something that is often missing from this conversation. So, young Canadians increasingly interested in starting their own businesses, partly because traditional career paths are not necessarily all that stable anymore, and this is something that, gives them a little bit of control over their future. What do you think is driving that shift, and what kind of support do young entrepreneurs need the most?
Yeah, to your point, I think it's multifaceted. One, you're right. Gone are the days of going to work for Bell for your life, right? And then getting that gold-plated pension at the end of it. The world has changed so much from a labor market perspective, in that those guaranteed jobs for life just aren't there anymore. So you're inevitably going to be job hopping. And there's actually data to demonstrate that those that do job hop more frequently actually drive their compensation up faster than their peers that don't do that. And so
Right.
hence it actually is encouraged to that. But that's also a challenge, and changing your job every couple of years, or even more frequently in some cases, that's not fun. It's tough and it's hard. It's exhausting, and so I think that's one reason why some are looking to start their own careers, our own jobs, etc. It's also a lot easier today with technology. How many times have we heard people talk about a side hustle, right? And sometimes that side hustle is their actual goal and ambition to drive that company, but they're not ready to make that leap yet. But the reality is, the way the world is, again, technology, cost, you can have that side hustle, you can drive it until it's ready to make that leap. So that's something that's changed a lot with technology and things like that. And then I just think there's the demographic characteristics that you've got. Certainly the younger generations don't necessarily want to conform to the same, kind of archaic policies that we've had, say, around in-office work, 9 to 5, and then we're still going to bug you all night and evening, via email. And so because they don't want to conform to that, and they've got different, they respond to different leadership styles and want that remote work, they're more likely to, be at home, and because the cost barriers aren't there, you don't necessarily have to have brick and mortar. You can explore creating your own company yourself, be your own boss, have that flexibility. We hear more about work-life balance now than ever before.
First of all, this idea of job hopping, I've definitely heard this from people, that there is very little ability for growth and movement within existing workplaces, and you do tend to get a higher income if you make a move to a different place every so often. Now, we went to the same high school, just a few years apart from each other, and you may remember at the time they would always say, like, oh, you're going to have 7 jobs in your lifetime. It wasn't, again, you referenced Bell, you're not one job for the rest of your life. You might have a better sense of me on the numbers. Like, even if you do not go into working for yourself, how many jobs are we up to now? Is it still 7? Is it higher than that?
I'm gonna think it could be approaching double that, and it's not
Right.
it's not crazy to think that now, and it's because because the statistics bear it out that if you want to earn more money faster, you're better off doing that. Now, does that mean you're going to be more fulfilled at the end of the day, and is that better for the job landscape? No, it's maybe not. But if you're just being purely selfish and want to maximize your earning potential, and especially with women who have been disproportionately had barriers against them for years, it makes way more sense for them to job hop to increase their earning potential.
So the knock-on effect, or at least the narrative from employers, is that, people come and work for us, they leave in a couple of years. We're not going to put a pile of training into them. It's not worth it. They're just going to leave anyway. We know a lot of that training used to happen in the workplace. Some of it has moved into the post-secondary education sector, but I think this actually makes the risk of going out on your own a little easier because that training's not there. We were talking earlier before we hit record that the benefit side is not there. So, turning your side hustle into a full-time gig without any kind of safety net maybe isn't as scary anymore because you already don't have a lot of those safety net features in the broader workplace.
Very true. And that's why I'd say, though, the employers that get it, that want to retain the top talent, they're the ones that have the very clear, very public, this is a clear career growth path for you, right? And so there's no surprises, there's no wondering, there's no having a hard conversation with my boss to know what it takes to get to here. It's a very clear map, progression, you do X, Y, Z, you get here, etc. The employers that get that and follow through on it authentically are going to retain the top talent. So that's important to note, and we see that with a lot of businesses in our chamber and other chambers that are wrestling with retention. If they work to make sure that their employees are being invested in and have a clear growth map, they're more likely to keep them. Something as transparent as publishing salaries now, for instance, on job ads, being more transparent. We know, for instance, that is now benefiting women who have, again, traditionally had barriers against them with lower paying jobs, et cetera, for doing the same work. Never should an employer ask the question, well, what did you get paid in your last job? Especially because they're trying to, again, that's what keeps people down and makes them want to leave, that environment, because there's just so many barriers against them. So the employers that get it, and will keep people. But you're right, it is much easier now. And again, because you're not necessarily leaving that job and you're not leaving a pension behind, you're not necessarily leaving deep benefits behind. So it's lower risk to go out on your own. There's no doubt about that.
So I want to touch on that a bit more because I was reading that, the average age of a successful entrepreneur is 45. I don't know if that means necessarily that maybe they're struggling before that age. I do wonder if it means that perhaps people are in these, more traditional environments and then kind of say at a certain point, maybe in their 30s and their early 40s, you know what, I can go out on my own. Maybe I've saved some money to go do that. Are you seeing that in the entrepreneurs you talk to, that they're around that age? Has there been a shift as well in more younger folks sort of entering this space?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's tied to the time that they're doing it. Some I just think are entrepreneurial in nature. They're going to take some greater risks. I think it's more on their personality type, how risk adverse they are, et cetera, on their level of success. And again, the risk you are, sure, you can have great success, but you can also have great failure, right? That's the one thing that very much defines an entrepreneur, right? There's going to be a lot of failure along the way. It's how are you learning from that failure?
Right.
There's, I wouldn't necessarily put an age to it because I've seen some very successful young entrepreneurs who've got a great product and they just need to figure out how to get it to market, how to get investors, capital investment, et cetera. And some, again, will make that leap later in life because maybe they got laid off. Maybe they just wanted to take that leap a bit later. So it's different factors. I wouldn't necessarily put I guess there's an age, but I wouldn't say it's indicative of everything, the age per se. I really think it's around their drive and how marketable their business is and how skilled they are. And not everyone, you can have a great idea and it doesn't mean they're necessarily a great business person either, right? I mean, how many stories we hear about doctors, dentists, et cetera, who are great at that craft, but the reality is that's a business. And sometimes they're not great business people, and they need to bring on the right partners. And we don't think of that side of it. Just because you're great at extracting a cavity doesn't necessarily mean you're great at balancing your budget or marketing your business. So there's all those factors that go into business as well. that will lead to someone's success or not.
That sort of leads me into something else I was thinking about, which is a big part of starting your own business is building up a network that can help you sustain that business going forward. Networks are everything, as you know. Something that younger people tend to not have as much of is a defined professional network that they have built up over time because they are younger. How can chambers of commerce, such as Central York, help young entrepreneurs create these, successful pathways to their own business ownership?
Great question. And it's one thing I think, again, the more savvy chambers are getting and realizing we need to adapt and engage younger business leaders. We recently launched our first Top 40 Under 40 award ceremony, and really just recognizing some of the great work that's happening in this area. It's important that we recognize young, business leaders on their way up. Because you don't necessarily want to wait till too late. It's because they're accomplishing some amazing things. But one thing I had someone, and I'd say we're a fairly progressive chamber. We do a lot of unique programming, a lot to support women in business, racialized Canadians, young people, etc. Someone said to me, this was the line, "This isn't my father's chamber of commerce." Because I think there's a real perception that chambers are a bunch of, old white guys handing out business cards, shaking hands. You almost want to go home and shower after, right? Because it's so transactional.
Right.
I don't want that to be our chamber, and I think the chambers that get it, want to get away from that. That's what a lot of them were back in the day. Now it's about designing the right programming for those individuals. So, for instance, for women in business, and it's not tied to age per se, but we have a Women in Leadership Development Program, WILD. That came out of recognition during COVID, especially. Women were disproportionately impacted during the pandemic, and so we knew we had a responsibility to help support their growth in business. So, it's been a very successful program. We've just launched CYC, Central York Chamber Next, which is all about targeting people in business under 40. So you might be a middle manager in a company, you might be a junior employee that just has great potential that your company sees. You might own your company and be leading it, and that's fantastic. So we have such a range, but we're trying to design the programming around connecting them with each other. There used to be a young professionals group in this area, and it kind of died because what ended up happening was you had a bunch of older people that just wanted to be part of it because they felt left out because they see all these young people, having a good time, the more social events, and then it kind of lost its purpose about young people networking with each other. And so while it's important that we do bring everyone together at times, there's also times where you want to be networking with people that are having similar issues, similar pain points, both earlier in your career. So you can have those conversations. Yeah, it's important you have mentorship and all those things and hear from business leaders that have been through it. But there's a lot to be said about, and sometimes we say this about young professionals, but also say new Canadians. What we find is with a lot of new Canadians and running businesses, they want to be around people that have maybe come from similar backgrounds, had similar experiences, and so that they can talk about the barriers they had around figuring out banking, those kinds of things, and share those similar experiences, and that's how you really learn.
I think this raises a number of good points because one, you do want to have those separate sort of spaces where folks with similar experiences can learn from each other. I think the mentorship piece is really important because if you are a young person, your local chamber is actually a great place to find potential mentors in the work you're doing. It's also a great place for your mentors to learn, what's hip and happening from the younger generation. You did touch on new Canadians there, and 1 in 4 Canadians, I believe this is the statistic, have thought about starting their own business. But 1 in 4 immigrant Canadians actually do start their own business. So what does that look like? What are some of the barriers and opportunities for, new Canadians coming up and starting in a business immediately? Like, I can only imagine coming to a whole new country and then also doing that on top of it. Like that is a wild experience. What does that look like in the community?
Well, I think it's been a necessity because they've had, again, employment barriers placed in front of them. And so they've got to figure it out, right? They've come here, and yes, they've had a job, but, as probably better than most about how many people come here and they're not able to get the credentials matched. And so you have so many people that are well educated in different fields and they just cannot get a job in that field. And so it's necessity. Right, and so they'll find these opportunities and they'll create them. I'll tell you, the last few last year or so, there's immigration has obviously been a hot topic in this country, student visas, things like that, and my fear is that in that I think we've had a flawed immigration system that does need improvements. But in trying to fix it, what we saw is almost like wholesale cuts to immigrant programs, things like that. And I think that's been a mistake. We had a startup visa program that saw drastic cuts in Canada. And these are people that were coming from different countries that literally had a business. They had IP, they had something. They were literally coming here to start a business, create a business. One of the first things they're doing is hiring people. And we turn the tap down on those people being able to enter Canada. It's not logical to me, right? It doesn't make sense. That's a program that actually should be seeing the tap turned on higher, because again, let's lure that talent from these countries, especially, look at the US right now, or different parts of the world where, there's conflict. If we can lure the IP and the talent here, we're going to attract the best of the brightest, and they're going to be the ones out of the gate hiring Canadians. That's what we want. And so I just think that maybe new Canadians, it's just, again, it's out of necessity that they're just having to create these jobs and create their own opportunity to get by.
I think that's a really good point. So, of course, I used to work in the Ministry of Advanced Education in Ontario, and we had put caps on international enrollment, but part of that was because of some of these institutions obviously using that as their entire bank account to generate funds for their school, as opposed to offering other programs to other folks. But I think you're right that turning off the tap to that group is really detrimental, not just for the people who might start a business and then hire people, but also the talent that people who are starting businesses here, who are maybe born in Canada, also want that talent pipeline. Like when we look at small businesses and entrepreneurs, it's usually 5 sectors. One of them is tech and scientific. And not that there isn't talent already in this country, but if you want the very best and you want your company to thrive, you do need to attract international talent as well. We saw this kerfuffle in the US between the president and his former advisor, Elon Musk, when they were making immigration policy changes there, that a lot of people in the tech community in the US started to be really concerned about the talent pipeline.
I agree, and that's where, again, we need to be attracting the best to Canada, and we have a very, I think, desirable place. We're a very desirable place to work, to live, to raise a family. Though you will say innovation has actually been on the decline in this country, and so we need to find ways to foster that. I look at the UK and. His brief time as Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, for I think a lot of warts he had and flaws as a leader. I think one of the interesting policies that he had was that if you had graduated in the last I forget number of years, I think it might have been 6 or 7 years, from a top 50 university globally, you basically got a pass into the country on a work visa. And think about that, right? That you're attracting people that have graduated from the Harvards, the Oxfords, the U of T's, the McGill into your country. If they've graduated from those schools, odds are they're pretty driven. and they're going to create opportunity. And so that's where I think, again, missed opportunity for us is when they cut the startup visa program, because those people were literally coming here to create jobs. We saw that. We partnered with a local digital transformation company, Tree Frog, and York University Schulich School of Business. And we created what was called Accelerate Central York. And we received funding from the province of Ontario on that. And it's an accelerator. And over 2 years, we had 300 individuals go through the program, representing just over 220 businesses. So somewhere multiple people per business. That program, it wound down 3 years ago, but we ran it for 2 years. We've kept track of the success. Those businesses have gone on to raise over $45 million in capital.
Wow.
They've gone on to hire 850 plus people. That's where the investment needs to be. Those are the jobs of the future. Some of them startups, some of them tech-based, some of them, very simple, but again, there's such a range of businesses. That's what communities need to be doing to help stimulate the economy is that those startup jobs. Gone are the days where you lure that big logo to town and they come with hundreds of people, outside of, say, a manufacturer or whatnot. But even then, we've seen how that can pause with Stellantis and things like that. But, you don't lure a Microsoft to town anymore with all the headcount because of remote work and things like that. So that's what municipalities and chambers need to revisit what economic development looks like. It's about supporting that startup economy. Those are the jobs in the future.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because, first of all, I had not heard about that, which seems like something that would have come into my ecosystem at some point, and that's an incredible project. But I think you're right. When you hear the number 850 jobs, that's equivalent to one of those big logos showing up in your town. But the danger isn't as big because, to your point, Stellantis, any of the automakers who have, pulled out of communities, and suddenly the community is just staggering because a significant part of its population has been impacted, and that has a ripple effect in the local economy, of course. So it's almost a better way to do it, to be positioning it as, just open by default to this type of investment in the community and job creators.
It mitigates that risk, right? You have all your eggs in that one basket. I mean, listen to Pete Buttigieg talk about South Bend, Indiana, and the Studebaker factory, right? And it's just, you see these Detroit, right, and with the auto industry, challenges and how it's shrunk as a city. You put all your eggs in one basket, you're in trouble. So that's where I think, again, and small business has always been the backbone of your economy in any country, frankly. That's where all the jobs are. Yes, obviously large employers are critical and important and serve a great purpose, but the more you're doing to support that kind of startup economy in this day and age, and especially in a more global world where you're able to sell products, unless you want to sell to the U.S. right now, it makes sense. That's where the investment needs to be.
I'm glad you brought that up because when I was working for the Minister of Agriculture and Food, he also has small business tacked on as part of his ministry file. And, I started doing some research into how big an impact small businesses make in this country. And so 33% of entrepreneurs in Canada are in Ontario. So we're a major source of this type of work. But 98% of businesses in Canada are small businesses. Like, it's an enormous chunk. And then 63% of the workforce are employed by small businesses. So, we talk about these big companies all the time and give them all these, financial benefits from the government that they may or may not keep them in town. But this is an enormous source of well-being in this country, and for families as well.
It's critical. It gets overlooked. And to your point, it's sure like again, not to pick on Stellantis, but Stellantis, Honda, they all get the press, right? And when they come and go, because it can have a huge impact on a community. But again, and it's great if you're one of those communities that has those sites, and we're in a community that has benefited too from. But I also think we've done a great job of making sure that we've got that diversification of employment, and that's so critical in this day and age as a community if you want to make sure you're thriving going forward.
It's really funny to me because I remember when I was still in government, Amazon was doing their search for their, HQ2, their second headquarters. And eventually, I actually can't even remember who landed it, but I'm pretty sure I saw in the news recently that it was already, shedding jobs. So again, you put in all this effort, there was all these bids, there was all this money, there was talk of building different campuses and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, that didn't really have the benefit for the community that was expected. Whereas, a mom and pop shop that stays open on Main Street, and, you live in an area with a pretty robust Main Street as well with some of these businesses, and it brings people into the community down there as well in a way that, popping up a big warehouse maybe wouldn't.
100%. And I'll tell you, and what we've learned too about HK2 is that was really Amazon's kind of clandestine way of actually just capturing all kinds of data and sourcing it and having cities and communities, large and small, providing all that data. Like, think of the data they have now. They now have on every community almost in North America, because everyone wanted that at one point, right? And I know City of Toronto went in on that, but all those cities and communities provided all the data on commuters, education, everything. Think of what that's now told them about their customer base. It was a sneaky way of them getting all that information. So it was, listen, these large corporations are, they do well for a reason. They're very strategic and whatnot. But without the small business, your community has no heart, and you need that. And there's room for both, and you need both. But that's what generally is at the heart of the community. Like you said, again, I'm fortunate. We've got a beautiful Main Street that's made up of great small businesses, and it's they care so much about the community. And, and I will say, coming out of the pandemic, it was a big push amongst chambers of commerce, local municipalities to really push shop local programs. And we're seeing that again with the U.S. government imposing these tariffs and this real, pride, this patriotism in Canadians, which is so rarely seen, and about the importance of buying Canadian and supporting local and those things. And it's actually great to see that, and I do hope we maintain that because it's so critical for us as going forward in our future.
Not to diverge too much, but like the buy local movement has actually been, very successful in our home community of Newmarket. Part of the interest in Main Street is, architectural. It's very beautiful down there. There's a lot of nice old buildings. But the other part is it does feel like a very lived-in community. It feels alive to the point that now it's become a major film hub as well, because people want that look on the screen. So I think, we don't necessarily think about these knock-on effects of strong small businesses. It can be tourism. It can be bringing, huge industries in to take part in the magic of what's going on in a community. So it is a pretty big piece of that as well.
It is. And the buy local, and that's where also when Trump came out with the announcement on tariffs and there's a real patriotism, there's also a lot of misinformation out there too about buy local and shop local. Right. So perfect example, one of our major employers in this community is Mars Bar. And every Mars bar consumed in North America is made here in Newmarket, Ontario. The CD Candy, who makes rockets, or Americans will know them as Smarties, actually, all made here in Newmarket. But you're seeing a lot of boycott this company, and I saw at one point boycott Mars Bar, and it's like, no, they're here, they're hiring people. Yes, they're technically a U.S. corporation, but we also need to recognize that these companies are investing here, they're hiring people here. And so you've got to there's nuance, right, about, supporting shop local, things like that. So, because if people here are investing in my community, you're going to be darn right I'm going to support them, even if their parent company is American. Starbucks, yes, shareholders are it's New York Stock Exchange, et cetera. But there's Canadian shareholders, there's Canadian division. They're hiring Canadians locally. So we also need to balance all those things as well.
Right. Yeah. Especially given, just the workers alone, there are families relying on those paychecks coming
100%.
in. That actually does bring me up to my next question, which is I want to talk about some of the barriers to entry for becoming an entrepreneur, and also just some of the struggles entrepreneurs face, especially younger ones, because, like there's access to capital, affordable space issues. We already talked about mentorship a bit. What do you think is the biggest hurdle right now for starting a new business, and what solutions are out there that can help address it?
I'd say access to capital, and when we poll people that have gone through our accelerator businesses, that's probably number one right now. We definitely have seen the market tighten up on lending, and so that's an issue. But I will say, conversely, there isn't the pressure right now to have, say, brick and mortar space, office space. How many businesses do we know of that are, service-based, office-based industry where it's literally just a bunch of series of people working from home?
Right,
So
exactly.
whereas years ago, they would have all been in an office. I used to run a digital marketing company. It's now fully remote and no longer has office space. They don't need it. And that's what you'd often need a lot of capital for, and that brick and mortar would be capital intensive. However, while it's tougher to get capital right now, the pressure for some of that capital investment is also reduced. So that's at least a side effect of kind of that post-COVID world. I actually think the employers that are forcing everyone back, 100% to I just think those are employers that confuse surveillance with management, and
100%.
and sure, some companies you need it, but again, I used to work for a company that absolutely thought everyone had to be there in person, security purposes, all those reasons. They shifted during COVID. They amended, and now they're in a hybrid work environment. They still require people to come in, but just not the same frequency. And that's fine. I get it. You want still people coming into an office, culture, things like that. That's important for some large companies. But at the same token, if you feel that everyone has to be in, and it's just, I think that's where you're going to lose talent. So again, I kind of deviated a bit from the question on, but that's more around capital. One of those capital needs has been and the need for space. And again, we see that in the city of Toronto, right? And I get it, from an economic development perspective, the mayor, is really wanting all the banks and everyone to pull people back because of the spin-off effect. But this is where the world's changing. And we need to recognize that. And so, but, again, I'd say the other barrier, and this is more focused on, I'd say, the GTA, but broader, but it's, I think, really acutely an issue here, is housing affordability. And
Right.
I was at an employer recently. They literally manufacture robots that are involved in the manufacturing process. They start the operators of these robots at six figures. They can't find people. And they could be recent graduates, don't need deep education, need some college education, et cetera. But they can't afford to live in Newmarket, where I live, Aurora, very expensive community to live in. And so people are having to go further to afford a place that could support a family. And then again, with the ability to work remote and whatnot, then why am I going to go to an employer that's going to make me go there 5 days a week? So that's hurting some employers as well, is housing affordability. So that's I think one of the biggest issues, especially in the service industries,
Right.
Restaurants, hospitality, et cetera. They're really struggling to find people. My counterpart, she just left recently, but was in Prince Edward County, ran the chamber there. She'd say, everyone knows it's a beautiful spot in Ontario. People love to go there all summer, but it's so busy now. But there's the people that work there, that work in the wineries, the restaurants, they have nowhere to live. and it's tough. They're commuting from such a far distance that it just doesn't make sense mathematically. And so they've become and so many communities are in that situation because of housing prices or housing availability. That I would argue is one of the single biggest issues facing businesses and people in business right now.
As somebody who formerly worked in that ministry, I fully agree that the housing crunch is such a big piece of it. I live in Toronto, of course, and that's an enormous part of the conversation we've been having for the last few years. You have a huge service economy in the city, but no one can afford to live here. If they do live here, they live with, 10 other people and they all still pay insane prices. The thing we've seen lately is, your Uber Eats, DoorDash type person who actually lives in Brampton comes in on the GO train and then drives around all day delivering and then goes home late at night. And so you'll see these e-bikes on the TTC and stuff. And that's the reality we live in right now. I do think the work from home debate, I'm glad you brought it up because I think it is a big part of the opportunity for young entrepreneurs. You mentioned that it's confusing surveillance for management, and I feel the exact same way and have been ranting about this forever. But for younger folks who maybe didn't grow up with the culture of being in the workplace and having this very rigid management structure, they actually have the flexibility to look at the workplace differently and approach business in a different way. Can you talk about maybe that generational lens and what a benefit that might be to young people?
100%. And again, and that I actually think goes two ways. And it's because I also think what still exists in business is what's called a proximity bias. And so, for instance, if you are young, I would actually suggest, as much as I say, fill your boots, work wherever, whatever works, for you is best. But if you're also really driven to get ahead, you want to be around your leader a lot, right? And if your leader is going to the office every day, and if you're around them, and maybe your cohort, your peers in your same cohort aren't going in the same frequency, there's a greater likelihood you get promoted. Is that right or wrong? I don't know, but it's just that's what's happening, right? It's not
Right.
human nature, and that goes both ways, right? But some people really value the that work-life balance. So we've got our office, we're hybrid. So I always make sure there's at least 3 people in the office at any given time for safety, security reasons, and have enough people here. But if you're not scheduled to be in the office, you can work from wherever, and I'm good with that, and that works. I come in every day. I'd say at least 90% of the time. And it's just I enjoy it, but that's me. I used to fundamentally believe, and I'll admit, I'm going into COVID and that everyone should be in the office. I grew up in it was a work culture and places I worked in the past where it was frowned upon, right? If you weren't there, et cetera, and didn't work long hours. And that used to be me. And then I'll fully admit I've changed, and because I recognized again that surveillance versus management. As a manager, you should know what your employees' outputs should be looking like, not just the hours they worked, because that means nothing. You should be focused on outputs. That's what a good manager does. And frankly, if I was hiring managers now, my biggest advice to anyone is, how do they evaluate their direct reports a level of success? And is it, how do they measure what success looks like? Because if they can't quantify that, then they're probably just relying on metrics like, are they in the office? And that's such an archaic approach. But I think COVID has given us permission to look at life differently, to find that balance. My partner and I were going to a cottage rented it for 2 weeks. I'm taking the 2 weeks off, but she's taking 1 week off and working for a week while she's there. She doesn't have much vacation time, and that's fine. I get that. We'll adapt, but that's one of the flexibilities she's got in her job. So again, it's flexibility. I think is one of those things that's more important for young people than say their previous generations. And so if I'm an employer and I want to attract the best and the brightest talent, I'm going to make sure that I've got a flexible work environment, still demands results, but that gives them an opportunity to work in their best environment.
So this actually brings up a few things for me. You mentioned COVID. Women dropped out of the workforce quite a bit as a result of COVID because they had to be home taking care of kids who were being homeschooled for that period, that kind of thing. I don't know that they've rebounded quite enough yet. But it did sort of speak to, I've seen this in the past, like when a man loses a job and a woman loses a job, the response is often different. I have seen as like young people, struggling in the workplace. The man usually goes on EI. The woman usually enters retail, and that has historically been the case because, there's just the idea of, okay, I'll go get the paycheck. It's not a big paycheck, but whatever. And I think we're seeing this post-COVID with the changing nature of work and flexibility and things like that. We know historically, like still when it comes to taking care of things at home, women are usually the person doing that, whether it's, cleaning up things or child rearing or whatever it is. What are some of the opportunities for women when it comes to entrepreneurship to drive at that flexibility you were just talking about? Because to your point, it doesn't exist in all workplaces, but of course, entrepreneurship is a heavy lift as well. So is there opportunity there for women? Are you seeing more women entering this space? What's the landscape of entrepreneurship look like for women?
There's no doubt about it. Women are taking chances with entrepreneurial opportunities more so than ever before. There's a stat I saw recently, which I'm not going to get right, so I probably won't say it, but you can definitely see, for instance, the number of multi-level marketing companies that are targeting women for side hustles, right? You can be a mom at home, but you can deliver these products, and I'm not just, obviously back in the day it was Avon, things like that, but now there's these beach bodybuilding classes, things like that, and they're targeting women because women have been disproportionately impacted for decades when it comes to salary, income, etc. And so they need that extra money to catch up to their male peers. But you're right, because they're often balancing a bit more than a lot more than men in the workplace and at the home still. That they're more able to take on that, again, side hustle, entrepreneurial opportunity, and good or bad, it's I think some of these places take advantage of that. Some are whatnot, but and again, there's some women that again they're starting their own businesses. I met some women recently who joined our chamber, and they started a home staging company during coming out of COVID, and they're killing it. They're working with a number of real estate agents. They're expanding their warehouse space, the furniture they have, etc. They're doing very well. All they need right now is the real estate market to pick up a bit, but they're still doing well in this challenging market. But no, there's no doubt about it. It's I think I'm willing to bet. I don't have the numbers, but I'm willing to bet if you looked 30 years back, the number of women entrepreneurs versus male entrepreneurs is tiny compared to today. I'd say they're probably very close to balanced out. I'd still say there's probably more men as entrepreneurs, but there's definitely a higher percentage of women than ever before.
We've talked about, what entrepreneurs can do. We've talked about what chambers of commerce can do. What about government? So I want to ask about, municipal, provincial, federal, whatever level it is. What can they do to make sure local economies are, fertile ground for the next generation of business leaders from a policy lens?
Yeah, and then we're not going to solve it today, but housing is probably I think the single most critical. So the challenge is right now you've actually got all three levels of government thinking they can solve it, and that's part of the problem is they're all working different levers and not working together. And I almost think we need some kind of housing summit, if you will, with the brightest minds in this country to get together, put politics aside, put levels of government aside. What are the levers that we should be pulling at the right times, and how do we solve this problem? So that it's almost like that moonshot. We need a genuine solution about with housing. Two, again, to come back to access to capital, it's great that a lot of governments offer, say, tax credits for newer businesses, startups, etc. But remember how tax credits work. You have to be making money and paying taxes to appreciate a tax credit. So many businesses in
and
those
you have
early
to
days.
wait for it. Yeah,
exactly. And so many businesses in the early days, it's a cash flow issue. They're not, it's that they need that help out of the gate. That kind of pre-tax tax credit doesn't benefit you if you're not selling goods or you're not able to get your goods to market. So that's where I think very targeted grants, programs, things like that support basically direct cash infusion into some businesses. I also think this is where the government could learn a bit from the private sector and do things a bit differently. And this is not, I can't think of many examples where this is done globally. But for instance, we took a look at our accelerator, for instance. One of the things we did with our accelerator is we introduce all the businesses to venture capitalists. What's the first thing venture capitalists do? If they see potential with your business and product, they say, great, we want to invest. We want a piece of your company, right? It's like Dragon's Den. I don't have a problem with government saying, if we're going to give you some grants at the outset or things like that, we want a tiny percentage to ride some of that upside. Now it's still will cost them net in the long run, but it does create opportunity, and maybe you create a package where those people, if they're successful, they can also just buy out the government on that ownership at a reduced rate, so that they're not encumbered by it. Because I will say, in the venture capital world, there are some vultures. And this is where government could play a role in supporting those businesses, not be vultures, and these companies aren't going to get crippled in their growth in seeking that capital. And that's where I think government looks at doing things a bit differently. And again, I think as taxpayers, as residents, we need to be okay with government doing some things that are a bit out of their traditional ways. I'm open to something like that.
I think that's a really interesting idea, because that's functionally what government did during the Great Recession of 2008-9, except they did it with really big companies, of course. And we saw this during the early days of the pandemic. There was CERB, of course, to bail out folks, but we don't see a lot of investment into small businesses and entrepreneurs, despite the fact that they're most businesses in the country. They employ most people in the country. But a targeted approach like that, and I'm sure you could set up all kinds of, important metrics to make sure that the money was being used well, and et cetera, et cetera. But I really like the idea of doing that and having the buyback option, because one of the things that I've, always ranted about when I was in the education space was, government earning interest on tuition debt. And it never made sense to me that if we want a strong knowledge economy going forward, that we try and profit from people's, economic destitution as they're trying to, get started in the world. And that has never made any sense to me. But this is a different way, actually, again, to invest in, the future of our economy, is by directly doing it.
Yeah, and it's and for businesses, that early money can be so critical, kind of like politics, right? That's the old Emily's list, right? Early money is like yeast. But that's where again, that early money, and again, maybe it's tied to owning 1% or 2%, whatever. But just again, so that you're mitigating some risk from government. And again, I still think at the end of the day, it's going to cost government more, but will we create more jobs out of this and spur the economy? Absolutely.
It's fantastic. So just as we wrap up here, I always try to end on, like a positive, hopeful note, because I think that's a good practice in life at this point. What can our listeners do to support young entrepreneurs in general, to become very impactful in their own communities? How can we support this space and the people in it?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm very optimistic about the future, where things are going. I love again, I'm trying to find the positives and things the positive outcome that came with COVID and that remote work and greater flexibility, work-life balance, those kinds of things. So I think that's all important. I think we've actually created much better conditions in the last few years for that startup entrepreneurial economy than we have in decades leading into it. What I do think we need to do is make sure we're investing, the governments are investing in these, in innovation, research and development. We have seen a real drop in research and development funding over the last number of years compared to other OECD countries. But I think, again, what the average person can do is just be mindful of who's out there, who's doing what business is doing, do what you can to support them, because there's some incredible stories out there. And even if something as simple as a Google review can make a huge impact on a business, and you may not necessarily have the money to throw at a business or things like that, but when an entrepreneur is in the early days, whether it's a retailer, service-based industry, people look at Google reviews. That's the reality. And I say, even if you don't have the money to support, that can make such a mental difference for that person, that when they see that positive comment, that affirmation of what they're doing, I think that's so powerful. And so that we can all kind of cheerlead the progress of some of these companies in their early days and find ways to connect. That's the best part about my job, frankly, is I love to connect businesses. And I do it so frequently that I love to see businesses now working together because we brought them together. And again, as individuals, if you may not be a consumer of a product, but you might be able to connect them, again, very powerful. So those are things I'd encourage people to be mindful of, and how best to support young entrepreneurs, and not even just young in age, but early entrepreneurs. It's very powerful.
I think that's a really great note to end on. Thanks so much for joining me today, Chris.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the work you're doing here.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.